Welcome agents, a new Megathread has recently appeared on the official Division 2 Reddit page asking some specific questions about gear acquisition and Loot 2.0, which is the main topic for Title Update 6, which will be dropping before Episode 2. No ETA on a release date yet, unfortunately. Now today I want to take this opportunity to address the questions being asked in this post, and this will likely be similar to previous videos where I've discussed fixes for Loot 2.0. The way I see it is, the more I and we keep beating the same drum, the more likely the developers will consider these fixes. Instead of responding to the Reddit post, I will be sharing this video with the massive devs on Twitter, so please leave your own comments down below. With all of that said, let's jump right into this one. How is loot progression for you in World Tier 5? At best, loot progression on the very, very rare occasion gives me a piece of loot that I actually need for any of my builds. In almost all scenarios, even after tens or even hundreds of hours, the loot is never an upgrade or never even the right brand set for what I need. Now, loot progression is the most important part of a looter shooter game. It's meant to feel rewarding for the time you invest in the game, but the drops are so low, I mean less than 0.1% low on a piece of gear dropping that might actually be an upgrade, you end up feeling like, what's the point in even playing? Now, I know the devs don't want everyone to have the best builds without actually working for them, and I'd agree to that in some way, but there's just no clear progression path to actually getting the loot that you need. Now, TU6 did make some good changes to the crafting bench, allowing you to craft 500 gear score items, but it's not enough. This only allows you to pick the brand of gear, which is a huge step in the right direction, but it still doesn't fix the issue of getting a 500 gear score item that is an upgrade. Now, possible fixes are: I completely dislike the way stat allocation works and think it should go back to the system we use for the Division. Each stat should roll independently rather than part of some bigger stat allocation pool or pie, as the devs have stated before. This could fix the whole gear score issue by allowing the highest stat rolls to drop on the highest gear score items. Now, with that in mind, attribute ranges should never overlap between gear score levels. The worst 500 gear score attribute should match the best of a lower tier. Tiers could be as follows, as an example: 450 to 489 gear score, 490 to 499, and then we've got 500 gear score. That way if someone has a 500 gear score build, or you pick up a 500 gear score item, the bare minimum power of that particular item will match the next lowest tier, in this example 490 to 499. So this should hopefully bring gear score back to its former glory from the Division. Effectively, we should just go back to how the Division did the gear score. Now, these two changes alone would be a huge step in loot becoming meaningful. The current system makes your time feel worthless, and the lack of upgrades mean you rarely actually feel like you're getting more powerful, which, funny enough, is exactly what everyone wants. How would you like to farm specific items or brands? The Division introduced specific weighted drops to certain activities if you wanted a specific gear piece. Now, this in my opinion was a good idea. I think the Division 2 needs to go a step further. Weighted drops in the current state of the game would not fix the issue of being able to target specific gear or items. And that's not to say I don't think weighted drops could work alongside another system, but on its own, I don't think so. What I'd like to see is some sort of system which allows you to target a specific brand or item. Now, many people have suggested before that allowing different factions to have weighted drops would be a good way to go. And I just think it could be better if it was more specific, even if it was on some sort of rotation type system. One of the main issues with the weighted drops in the Division was they were tied to specific activities. That meant you'd have to run the same activity over and over again. So instead, this time they could tie it to factions, and that way numerous activities and missions could be played to get the gear and items that you want. Now, I think if it's done properly, there's a real chance here that we could choose an activity that we know will drop, say, assault rifles, SMGs, Providence, Fenris, and Alp Summer as an example. In fact, I'd go one step further than this and allow us to be really specific. And by this, I mean you choose the exact weapon you want, i.e. I want the AK, or the exact brand, i.e. I want Ariolda, or the exact piece of gear, i.e. I want gloves, for example. Now, I'm pretty sure this won't happen, but I really think this would allow us, or every player, to target the gear they actually need. If this was introduced, you could probably have some sort of cooldown maybe once per day for this specific example, because otherwise players could get their perfect build within 24 hours if they wanted. But let's not forget, even if you could be that specific, unless the attribute allocation has changed, and even if it does, you would still need RNG to get the exact role you wanted, i.e. the attributes you wanted, so it'd still be a little bit grindy, but it would be a lot more forgiving. What would make heroic missions and raids rewarding for you that you tackle these sort of challenges? Now, as it stands, heroic missions and raids, aside from the raid exclusive weapon and gear sets, they just reward you with 500 gear score items and more of it. But, as previously mentioned, this really means nothing. When you consider everything we've set up till now, there's a real opportunity for the highest gear score items to actually be meaningful, and I think heroic missions and raids should take full advantage of that. Now, I think higher difficulty content should reward loot that is at the highest stat range possible. For argument's sake, let's say the changes I've mentioned before come into effect, and 500 gear score items now have a stat range of 40% to 51% for damage to elites on a mask, and this is just an example. Well, a mask that drops with damage to elites on from a heroic boss should have a minimum damage to elites value of 48%. So 48% to 51% heroic boss damage to elites. I hope you're getting this. For challenging, it could be a minimum of 46%, for hard, 43%, and normal, it would be 40%. This way, if that mask were to drop on heroic, you have a guaranteed minimum damage to elites value, on a mask that's got damage to elites on of 48%, which will be rewarding for anyone who took the time to complete this difficulty level. This would as well mean that it's still possible to get these values on normal mode or in normal mode, but the chances are just much lower because the stat range is much greater. On normal you'd be doing 40 to 51%, but on heroic you'd be doing 48 to 51%. Now, with gear in mind, I think the same should apply for weapons. You should have a higher weapon range for, heroics and stuff. Mods it should apply for. And anything else in the game that uses this system, it should apply to. In respect of the raid, I personally like the idea of putting certain gear or weapons behind the raid, and I'd be happy for this to continue, but there are two problems. Firstly, like everything else in the game, getting the exotic weapon or exclusive gear sets is purely down to RNG, which I think is wrong. Take Destiny, for example. Their raids guarantee some raid exclusive loot each time you play. Yeah, it might not always be what you want, but there's a good chance you're going to get what you need. Now, part of this is because Destiny's raids come with a whole bunch of new gear and weapons, whereas the Dark Hours raid only came with one new gear set and one exotic weapon, meaning the devs had to significantly reduce the chances of players getting this stuff, so they spent more time grinding the raid. Secondly, the raid would feel more rewarding if 500 gear score loot actually meant something. Now, on a last note about the raid, the reason why hardly anyone has completed it is 1, because it's not rewarding, as discussed before. 2, 8 players for raid is just too much for this franchise. We're not playing WoW. And 3, it's not rewarding. Quality over quantity will always prevail in a game like this, but that's not what the raid or heroic missions offer. Except for the Eagle Bearer, which, by the way, is by far the best weapon in the game. Not even close, and I think it does need to be addressed as soon as possible. But that's a whole different point, but yeah, moving on. How would you narrow the loot pool that you eventually get the item you are looking for? Now, I've mentioned before kind of how I'd approach this, but to add some more ideas, they need to remove skill mods from the loot pool. Change skill mods so they act like weapon mods that, once equipped, scale with your skill power. This will remove a huge chunk of skill mods out of the loot pool. They need to remove the gear variations. There are currently a ridiculous amount of variations with gear, like the 511 backpack having 6 different variations. The difference in each one is quite negligible, but sometimes a specific type is required, meaning your chances of getting that piece are significantly lowered. I think it's completely unnecessary, and there should just be one type of Wyvern mask or one type of Fenris chest. There shouldn't be a million different types of each piece of gear. Next up, I think this fits in here, but please, Massive, please allow us to have 2 recalibrations for one piece of gear. You should be either able to roll 2 attributes, or 1 attribute and 1 talent, or 2 talents if you wish. They need to remove the recalibration restriction on attribute colours. I think you should be able to swap red for yellow or blue for red, etc. The devs would have to figure out a way of avoiding broken builds this way, but hey, I'm just giving you suggestions that I know the community would like. They need to reevaluate the attributes and talents in the game totally, I think. Why do we have a health attribute, but also have a health percentage attribute? The same could be said for armor and armor percentage. There are many attributes and talents that I think just simply need removing. The amount of possibilities makes it so every piece of gear that you get is so diluted. It's almost impossible to get the gear that you want. The devs took the complexity out of the Division and ramped it up 100%, but really added no value except grind and horrible RNG. This is all I can think of for right now, but I'm sure you guys have a lot more, so leave it in the comments down below. Do you have good examples of how you would like to get the equipment for your character, maybe how other games do it better? Firstly, if this question is coming from the devs directly, huge props, because so many developers these days don't want to look at what other games are doing well as a means of fixing their own game. Just take Anthem for example. It was reported that you were strictly forbidden to compare Anthem with Destiny, and the developers at Anthem didn't want to know what others were doing, and look how that turned out. Off topic, I know, but I've mentioned before how Destiny deals with raids, and I'd highly recommend the devs look at the loot system there, as well as the whole game, to be honest. I think the loot system in Destiny is, at least in my opinion, it's very good. The loot system from the Division was actually pretty good towards the end, partly because of the optimization station, so maybe they would need to revisit that. I personally miss the loot system from the early days of the Division, where the drops weren't that often, but they actually meant something, and I think something like that would be better. As of right now, loot drops everywhere all of the time, and as I said before, I think quality over quantity trumps every single time. How could the existing content of the Division 2 be used to have a targeted loot progression? Now, I think I've answered this one before with weighted drops or specific drops from certain enemy factions. Maybe you could find a way to incorporate this into bounties, because right now I think bounties are pretty pointless, but if we could target specific loot, then these would be much more viable. What is important to note, and I must stress this, the developers cannot lose the core looter shooter aspect of the game. I've mentioned plenty of changes here which on paper, they sound great, but what none of us want is a game where we can all get, the best builds we'd ever want in 24 hours. No one is complaining about grinding for the gear they want, but there needs to be a light at the end of the tunnel. There needs to be a carrot on the stick for us to chase. And that's what I hope TU6 can change, and I hope that some of these fixes, if not all of these fixes, can help achieve that. I'm going to leave this one here, guys. Like I said, I know this sounds like I'm banging the same drum, but the developers now more than ever are listening, and I really think there are a lot of changes we as a community have come up with in this video that would make a huge difference to the gear acquisition and loot in this game. I want to thank you all for all of your support. Thanks for sticking around until the end. If you haven't liked the video already, please do. It really does help support the video. Share it, subscribe if you haven't already, and you want to stay up to date with all Division related content. With that said, I hope you all are having a fantastic week, and it's almost the weekend, so I hope you all have a fantastic weekend as well. And until the next one, epic out.